Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Ethos Online. Again, this is a space where we can be, belong, and become the very best version of ourselves. So, wherever you're joining us from, welcome. We have people from Michigan, Colorado, we have people from Washington, California, Idaho, all over the states. We have people viewing, listening, watching what we're doing, and it's just been so much fun. And so, again, we want to thank you for joining us in this deep study over the Bible. And many people will ask me, Tony, why are we still reading this ancient book? Right? We have so many other pieces out there. And I would argue that the more I read it, the more I seek to understand it, the people, the culture, the context, the bigger, the more beautiful it gets. And so the deeper we delve into these books, the bigger questions we ask, I think the application gets even more beautiful, even more obvious. And so we have been moving through again this book, Genesis, and we're going to step into chapter 13 today. And 13 has some real beauty to it and some subtlety. And so before even stepping in, I'll do our reminder, right? This is not a history book. This is a beautiful compilation of big stories, epic stories. This is a big combination of poems and warnings from kings to their people, warnings from prophets, moments of saying, hey, Israel, look at where we've been, look at where we're going, look at what it could be if we would just choose not to repeat the same cycles. And so this is what Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy was. And it was all compiled there in 587 BC when they are taken by the Babylonians. Again, their temples destroyed, their whole religious system flipped upside down. They become captive. And so Torah is the written response to the fear of assimilation, the fear that they will become just like the other nations, right? They'll take on their gods, they'll take on the rituals of Babylon. But the beautiful element, what makes Israel different than so many other tribes, is that Israel says, we're going to keep Judaism Jewish, right? We're going to stick with these beautiful traditions, these beautiful values we have. We're not going to forget our story. And so to be Jewish, right, is to not forget your story. It's to keep remembering, to keep reminding who you are, where you've been, where you're going. That's what it meant to be Jewish. And I would actually argue to be Christian today is to know your story, to know where you've been, where you're going. And oftentimes we understand the Christ is the guide, right? This is what life more abundantly looks like, feels like, is walked. That's the idea. And so we say this every week, right? Torah is the written, it's the narrative of Israel, miniaturized through these tellings. Abraham, Moses, Isaac, um, Adam, Eve, right? Noah, all these different characters, they all are representations of Israel, right? And that doesn't mean they weren't real people. It means the reason that the stories are told of them was not to capture history, but to remind Israel this is who we are. And it's so good. And so Abraham, right? Abraham is this is the messianic character that moves them out of their old tribe, right? Steps out. Abraham literally means the father, right? The father of Israel. And so, again, you're reading this as a Hebrew, right? And you're reading father of Israel comes into the picture. Father of Israel does this. That's the idea, right? The father, better translation again, founder. He is the founder of Israel's journey. He's stepping away from the tradition. So, again, to be a Christ follower means you step away from traditions. Yeah, you question things. You don't just let it lie, do you? You question, you move, you grow, you evolve, and then you do it all over again. That's what it meant to be a Hebrew. And so, Genesis chapter 13. Genesis chapter 13, really fascinating couple chapters. We're going to go 1 through 6, verses 1 through 6. And so, this is what verses 1 through 6 says. And Abraham came up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that was his, and Lot with him, to the south, right? And Abram was very heavy with cattle, with silver, and with gold. And he went on his journeys from the south and until Bethel, until the place where his tent had been previously between Bethel and Ai, right? to the place of the altar that he had made at first. And Abram called there in the name of the Lord. And also Lot, who went with Abram, had flocks and cattle and tents. And the land did not bear them to dwell together, for their possessions were many, and they could not dwell. All right. So many people, when they read this set of verses, they're like, what are you going to get from that, right? How can those 6 verses have any kind of like interesting depth? Well, again, when you look at the words, when you look at the authorship, when you remember who Israel is in their journey, there's so many beautiful things here. So I'm just going to go a couple of verses by verses. I'm going to look at words, phrases, and we're just going to delve into this. And there are interesting rabbinical interpretations here that I want to share with you. Right? Rabbis have been interpreting these for centuries. And so, actually, one of the rabbis that is oftentimes associated with Jesus, when Jesus is saying, you've heard it said this, what about this? Oftentimes he'll say certain things that were actually connected to a rabbi of the time just before Jesus. His name was Hillel. We'll borrow from some of the concepts of his Hillel today. So let's delve in. And Abram came up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that was his, and Lot with him to the south. So again, they're not just simply saying south to say a direction, right? For the Hebrews, when they write about north, south, east, west, all of this has connections. So again, to go south, right? To go south, this was the deeper idea of like Israel is moving away from captivity. They're moving away from beastly empire when you talk about directions, and so Israel chooses to kind of step away from the thing that brings death. Right? They're moving away from Egypt, and so this direction, this movement away from Egypt, this is a big deal. Right? They're stepping away from the things that are ruining their value system, taking away their ritual, causing them to not act Jewish. Right? So again, directions are everything. We keep going. And Abram was very heavy with cattle, with silver, and with gold. Now, I remember hearing this as a kid. And I remember pastors would often say, see, God is blessing Abram. And Abram now has all this gold and all this stuff. He's got bling. He's going through the desert. He's going home. Pharaoh better give him all that stuff, right? Because he's the founder of Israel. He deserves that. Well, here's the thing. Here's what we miss. Silver, gold, cattle. Who has silver, gold, cattle? Who has all those blessings? Which empires have this? Well, here's the thing. They are weighed down. It says they are weighed down. Who has all that stuff? Egypt has that stuff. Egypt, the beastly empire that enslaves people, right? Egypt, the place you are brought out of, looks like that. Gold, silver, cattle. They're so wealthy. And they're wealthy because they have taken those resources from people and they've done it often dishonestly or on the backs of other people's work. Now think again what Abraham has done. He has taken those things in a very deceitful way, right? He's basically lied to Pharaoh and he's gotten all this stuff. Again, it's a dishonest thing. And the idea here, he is weighed down by blessings. Kind of weird to think about. He's weighed down by all this stuff. Before he got there, they were looking to survive famine. But they leave with all this stuff, all this baggage, all this blessing, or on the surface, blessing. I have a friend, he made so much money for a while. He was working in the business industry. He was a big shot in these corporations, a pretty large corporation. And he said he knew deep in his heart some of the stuff he was doing went against his values. But he said, Tony, I was making so much money. He had the nice cars. He had the large house. He was able to talk to other people at the parties and say, hey, man, here's what I'm doing. And people would kind of gather around because when you're doing stuff, when you're making money, you've got a story and people want to hear more. And so they'd gather around him. And he said for a time, he felt so good about himself. But he said that only lasted for so long. And before he knew it, he couldn't buy enough stuff to keep him distracted from that hole, that empty that he was feeling. So he said he started struggling through what would really bring me a sense of happiness, fulfillment, right? What would bring me that sense? And so he worked through a lot of his own passions, his own energy. What do I want? What's fulfilling? What brings life to the world? And my friend, he traded his Audi for a Forest Subaru Outback or whatever you want to call those, a far cheaper vehicle, right? It's kind of like a mom mobile. He traded his Audi for that. He traded this amazing job where he was making so much money, and he became a math teacher. Yeah, a math teacher at an at-risk inner city school. And he said, Tony, I have never been happier. He said, all of that baggage, that stuff that I had, I began to see they were not things that were bringing fulfillment. They were things that were bringing me down, bringing me closer to pain, guilt, shame. Those things were not filling me. I wanted them to desperately, but they weren't. I was out of alignment. And he said, when he began doing the things that brought life and giving back, he said, that is when life started to happen again. There was this interesting study, Raphael Badziag. He wrote this interesting article in Business Insider. He actually did a long interview process. He interviewed a bunch of billionaires. He interviewed all these billionaires, and he asked them, are you happy? Again, these billionaires, this 1% of the population. He took a year to spend time with these guys, these men and these women. And what he found was this. Most of them said, you know what? I've finally gotten to the place where I experienced happiness. But they said it was not because, he said every single one of them said it was not because of their wealth. And I know what you're thinking. Yeah, anyone that's got money can say that, right? They can afford to say that. But he started really digging into their stories. And he found that a lot of them, when they got a lot of wealth, coincidentally, at the same time they had all this wealth, they also had serious depression, anxiety, loss of friendships. They didn't know who their friends were anymore. They all just wanted their money. And so they said they felt very alone in those first couple years as they acquired wealth. Here's a couple quotes I found fascinating. What I found out in my research is that money isn't doesn't change much about your ability to be happy. It just magnifies your personality. Notice that it magnifies your personality. Happy people become happier, and unhappy people become miserable when they get wealthy. And so, wealth, really, money should not be the thing that you look at to bring you happiness. It's only going to make your personality worse or better. It's only going to highlight really who you are. And the real question is, who are you? Yeah, who are you? Because that's what's going to come out in the wash, isn't it? Another quote I found interesting. To become a billionaire means a huge investment of time, energy, and effort. It means committing decades of your life and working 24/7 at the expense of your private life and your family life. It means not being able to take vacation or having leisure time. It means huge burden of responsibility and stress. And yes, you are lonely with your problems. There's nobody around who can help you with the problems of the magnitude that you cope with. I found that really interesting. Blessings can sometimes become a burden. Yeah, like Abraham. Becoming extremely wealthy can create sometimes more problems. And here's the last quote again I found fascinating. For many, money caused serious problems at first. Those who started successful found ways to learn from their mistakes and grow. They admitted they could learn these lessons with or without money. That I found really interesting. Money, wealth isn't the reason for happiness. It's not going to bring happiness. And sometimes, according to so many of these billionaires, it actually created more problems, more stress, more unhappiness. For many of them, it created more burdens. Fascinating, right? So, Abraham, chapter 13, Abraham takes on blessings, gifts from Egypt, and it says he is weighed down. He's weighed down. Let's keep reading. And he went on his journeys from the south until Bethel, until the place where his tent had been previously between Bethel and between Ai. Now, here's a really interesting a rabbinical interpretation I wanted to share with you. And again, understand this, rabbis for centuries and centuries, they've been coming together and reading these pieces. And so again, I'm going to look at what some of the Jewish scholars have said, the people who actually wrote this book. What did they say about it? And so, according to many rabbis, just before the time of Jesus, this Hillel individual we were talking about, the space between Bethel and Ai, um, this is where basically it's a metaphorical concept, and the idea here is it's where someone settles debt. They settle issues that might be holding them back. The space between Bethel and Ai is this liminal space where you're trying to figure it out. It's the place where you say, I owe you a little bit of money and I need to take care of that before it weighs me down. Yeah, it's really interesting. I like some of these quotes. It's not the future you're afraid of, it's repeating the past that makes you anxious. Here's the thing, sometimes, right? Sometimes we have to learn from the past, accept the mistakes we made, because if we don't, the new space that we get to, if we're not careful, we might just bring with us the cycles and the brokenness from the past. Right? Abraham has this moment, and it's such a beautiful metaphorical thing here. Abraham is leaving Egypt. He made some pretty big mistakes. He's leaving the famine life. But the question is, Abraham, will you take all that stuff with you? Because if you do, it's going to weigh you down. It's becoming a burden for you. And so the question is, in the space between Bethel and Ai, right? Will you let it go? Because if you don't, again, it's going to hurt relationships. It's going to bring pain. It's going to bring brokenness. So will you let those things go? Will you forgive when you need to forgive? Will you pay the debts that you know you need to pay? Right? Will you take care of that stuff before you get to the place where you're supposed to multiply and grow? If you don't, the growth is not going to be what it could be. Right? That is so heavy, so good for right now, the stuff that we go through daily. What kind of stuff right now do you need to deal with that you might not be dealing with before you step into the new thing? Right? Before you step into the new community, before you step into the new relationship, the new job, the new series, book series, or whatever it is, I don't know. But whatever the thing is you're about to step into, ask yourself some questions. Am I in the space between Bel and I? Do I need to take care of some things? Are there conversations that need to happen? That's the deeper idea here. As you're leaving Egypt and you're heading home, what needs to be dealt with now? Goes on, to the place of the altar that he had made at first. And Abram called there in the name of the Lord. Again, here's the cool thing. He learns, he's letting go, he builds the altar, he creates a symbol. To be Jewish, to be a Hebrew person, is to be constantly creating some kind of visual for yourself and your people. And this is not an idol. This is something that is a visual representation where we've been, where we're going. It's a reminder. And Abraham sets this up so he can say, look, I took these steps. We made this promise. We are going to do it differently. We let go of this thing here. And the next generations, when they pass this thing, they'll remember we let go of this stuff. We didn't carry Egypt on our backs to the promised land. We didn't carry burden to the promised land. We let that go. And also Lot, who went with Abram, had flocks and cattle and tents. Now here's something that's very odd, and some people don't even question it, but it is an odd thing here. It says, and the land did not bear them to dwell together. Well, why not? Why can't Lot and Abraham dwell together? I mean, they're relatives. Shouldn't they be able to live together? It says, for their possessions were many, and they could not dwell. So this says a tremendous amount right here about community. Sometimes there are two groups that are occupying the same space, right? Or maybe one group grows so much, and out of that comes two different groups. This happens in companies, families, churches. It happens so many times. I've experienced this. It'll happen. And what'll take place is ultimately they'll begin to create different identities. And out of those identities, vision, values, all will change. And it's very easy. It's so easy for the two groups to begin to fight and bicker. They'll see themselves as antagonists to their own stories and their own visions and their own purpose. And so these two different groups, if they don't learn to bend and get along, they could become adversaries. So out of the two groups, if the two leave, right? If the one is able to step out while the other is preserved, something beautiful can happen. I have some pictures here. That's Steve Jobs and that's Wozniak. These two people helped create something really interesting that you all know. Yeah, Apple, right? But what you may not have known, Steve Jobs was working at Atari. Wozniak, Hewlett Packard. And what these two individuals understood is, look, even though these two companies are great, we love these companies. Here's the thing. We have become something different. We've grown. We're going to step away a little bit. And like Lot and Abraham, they went a different direction. And that's okay sometimes. And they did. And from that is birthed Apple. Yeah, so good, right? Those two rockers up there at the top. Many of you listening, you may not even know who these people are, but there was a group in the '90s called Metallica. But what you may not know is this group, before they got big, their lead guitar player said, "You know what? This music is good, but it's just not filling me. I need to step away." And so the lead guitar player for Metallica stepped away and he created his own band. And his own band, Megadeth, became this other really big band. And before you knew it, these two guys, they're still friends. They understood that sometimes Lot and Abraham have to have some space because they're moving in different directions. And for the communities to thrive, sometimes they need to be able to follow the directions their hearts are taking them. Andrew Mason, he created something called Groupon. He actually created it in order to cancel his cell phone, which is kind of a funny concept here. But he does this out of necessity. He stepped away from his job, all of that, because he understood there's something bigger that I need to follow. And so when we're in the middle, sometimes visions and directions can change, right? In a company or a friendship. And if we're willing to be okay with that, to value the other person, then we can keep friendships and connections strong. This is what Steve Jobs said. And I just find that such an interesting idea. If we can value the other person, then we can wish them well and support them through it in the new direction they're going. We don't have to be adversarial. Yeah. So good, right? And also Lot, who went with Abram, had flocks and cattle and tents, and the land did not bear them to dwell together. And so again, this beautiful idea, Lot goes his direction, Abraham goes his. They learn from the past. They learn not to carry all of the burden, the brokenness on their shoulders when they stepped into the new direction that both of them had on their hearts, and they went their separate ways. And the story is so good because both of them at this point in time are choosing not to be weighed down. Isn't chapter 13 good? This is just a couple of these verses, right? Just 6 of these verses, and there's already that much in it. So good, right? The Bible's so filled with all of this. And so, how can we take it home? What do we do? What kind of application can we pull from this? Well, here's one that I think is just an obvious one and a really beautiful one. The idea of leaving the past behind. When you are about to step in the new thing, how do you ensure that you're not carrying Egypt on your back? You're not weighed down while you're walking into the new. Number one, learn from the past. Don't dwell there. I think for many of us, we get so caught up in the I should have, if I could have, if I would have. We get so caught up in the past that before we know it, all we're thinking about is that, and we're no longer living in the present. So why can't we just learn to accept the past? It's the past. It happened. It cannot change. You worrying about it, thinking about it, losing sleep over it is not going to change it. Only you stepping into the present and living it, learning from the past, is what's going to make a difference in your life. Number 2, express yourself. right? Don't hesitate to get the pain you're feeling off your chest. So, whether discussion with someone else to find like time to do that, or self evaluation, whatever it is, talking to someone, talking to yourself, looking at yourself, look at yourself a little deeper. Try to find, what is it that I'm feeling in this moment? What is it that I've learned? Talk to other people about the pain you might be feeling. Abraham, right? He's probably walking through the desert saying, "Man, I can't believe I did what I did." Right? I hoard out my wife. Are you kidding me? Abraham is not going to be able to thrive in the new land if he is carrying that burden anymore. He's got to let it go. He's got to learn from it, but he's got to let it go. And I think many of us, we need to let some things go, and we need to find the words to use to describe how painful it was, so that then we can move through it. Number three, stop pointing fingers. This is a big one. Stop blaming everyone else for your problems. Because I know for me personally, it's the easiest thing in the world, right? We like to play that card, the victim card. It's their fault, their fault, their fault. The problem is, when I get in that place, always, every time I do, I forget that I have control over my reactions, how I respond to the stressors. I don't have control over what someone does or says about me. I don't have any control over that. So why put energy into it? What I can do is I can focus on my reaction to it. And hopefully my reaction is going to be a better reaction than it was 3 or 4 years ago, right? Number four, focus on the present. Again, remind yourself, I am living now. What is happening now? When you get caught up in that guilt storm, the shame storm, stop and say, what's happening right now? What am I doing right now that is so good, that's so full, so rich? What is happening now? I think when we do this, our whole way of viewing the world will shift. And then lastly, forgive those who wronged you. And that includes you. That includes yourself. And so forgiveness, again, forgiveness is a process. It's for you. It's not about the other person, really. It's about you. Because once you have forgiven, you can move on. You can abide in the new place. You can walk in the new direction fully. But if you're still holding on to the anger, the frustration, the bitterness, you're never going to fully abide in the promised land. And so maybe there's someone you need to forgive. And maybe it's you. Everyone, thank you so much for joining me today. Moving through chapter 13, this book is so rich. As always, I would love for you to continue working with us, supporting what we do, ethos-church.org/donate. What we're doing, we spend so much time researching. We spend so much time putting this together. This takes energy. And so giving, supporting this, passing these links out to people, that's so helpful to continue the work we do. If you want to continue joining us in live discussions, please let us know. Ethos Living Rooms. We try to do this twice a month. And as always, please hit the subscribe button. Pass this around. Let people know there is good stuff happening as this group goes through the book of Genesis. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. We love you, and we'll see you next week.